The Ernesto Betancourt keynote address this year will be given by George Borjas, who has been described as America's leading immigration expert. He's the Robert Scrivner Professor of Economics and Social Policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He's the recipient of the 2011 Institute for Study of Labor, ASCE Prize. This is the most prestigious award for labor economics in the profession. Previous recipients, such as Dale Mortensen or Christopher Pisiarides, went on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. Professor Borjas' academic work was recognized because it provided a sound theoretical and empirical framework for studying the welfare and distributional effects of migration. He's one of the leading figures in the ongoing intense debate on immigration in the United States, assimilation and migration selectivity. It's a pleasure to have him. His talk is entitled Immigration and Economics, Lessons for Policy.
Muchas gracias. Voy a empezar en español, pero cuando llega esto tengo que cambiar a inglés. Quiero empezar en español porque soy economista y a los economistas les gustan los modelos y la teoría y todo tiene que ser organizadamente, perfectamente. Y quiero decir una historia de inmigración que pasó en Miami, 7 cuadras de aquí, en la Freedom Tower. Cuando llegamos de Cuba, mi mamá y yo hace como más de 50 años. Me acuerdo que el día después que llegamos tuvimos que ir allí a llenar papeles y iban a hacer algo con nosotros, y la persona que estaba en cargo del caso de nosotros quería que mi mamá se fuera para California. So, la conversación entera fue convencer a mi madre que yo no debe quedarse en Miami y debe mudarse a California. Y yo estaba, en mi mente, era un niño en la piscina de mi casa que tenía en California, y la estrella de Hollywood iba a estar amigo conmigo y esas cosas, ¿verdad? Pero entonces mi mamá casi que estaba ya lista para decir que sí, vamos para California. Entonces en ese momento una mujer detrás de nosotros dijo: no vayas para allá, hay terremotos allí. Y ese fue el final de California. La historia es interesante porque en las teorías nosotros siempre tenemos un epsilon, un error, y para mí epsilon siempre ha estado earthquakes. Eso es el cambio de la vida entera que pasa por un random event. Déjame cambiar de idea ahora porque otra historia de inmigración que quiero decir que también es verdad. Y la historia goes back to Jimmy Carter, when Jimmy Carter was president, and it's January 1980. And this actually happened. I know somebody who was in the Oval Office, and he's told me the story of what happened at that point. And Jimmy Carter invited Deng Xiaoping, who was the vice premier of China, for a visit to the White House. The very first time that the Chinese of that level had visited the United States. And the reason Jimmy Carter wanted to visit so bad was because Jimmy Carter was very concerned with human rights, and especially human rights in China. And Jimmy Carter literally prepared a binder of complaints that he wanted to bring up with Deng Xiaoping about all kinds of human rights issues in China. Deng Xiaoping goes to the Oval Office, and Jimmy Carter brings the binder, opens it up, and starts going page by page of complaining of human rights in China. And eventually they get to the page that has to do with immigration. As all of us know, communist countries did not allow their people to leave easily for many, many years. And Jimmy Carter was going to tell Deng Xiaoping, how can you possibly think you can join modern civilization and modern human rights if you don't let your people go? And Deng Xiaoping sat back, thought about it, and smiled, and he said, Mr. President, you're right. Absolutely right. How many Chinese nationals do you want? 10 million? 20 million? 30 million? That was the end of the discussion. Okay? This actually happened, okay? And the reason it's important to tell that story, like the other story I just told, is because not only the random events sort of drive migration flows in ways that an economist could never really model, But Deng Xiaoping put his finger on a question that any industrialized nation today has to answer. And that is, how many immigrants are we willing to admit? You know, we're going to argue over defense, I'm going to argue over amnesty, but nobody really argues or even talks about that fundamental question. Many, many more people want to come to the US than the US would ever be willing to admit. So the question is, how many are we willing to admit? You know, it's a reasonable question to ask. Maybe economics has something to say about it. And just suppose for a second that Jimmy Carter had actually thought about this for 5 seconds before the meeting with Deng Xiaoping and decided, you know, maybe 10 million Chinese nationals over the next 10, 20 years is not so bad. And he could have told, you know, to Deng Xiaoping, you know, 10 million. That would be the answer to the question, right? But Deng Xiaoping could then have thought again a little bit more and could have said, which 10 million do you want? We have 1 billion people to choose from. And that is the other central question in immigration that we never talk about either. So not only do we have, immigration policy really consists of 2 questions. How many people does a country want to admit? And out of the many who want to come to a country, which formula you're going to use to select the winners and the losers? What method of discrimination are you going to use to allocate visas? What I want to do now is sort of show you a little bit about the history of US immigration policy. I want to tell you something that a lot of people, even people, I believe I've had people in my class who presumably make up the policy in Congress, you know, senators and congressmen, and they don't even know the way the policy works. I mean, somebody writes it for them and on we go. So I want to tell you a little bit about the policy. I want to now turn to economics a little bit, show you what we think we know about economics and immigration, and then return at the end to those 2 questions and ask, what does immigration have to say about the kind of policy we should have? Okay? So let me start by giving you a little bit of history and put it in context. Right now, 3% of the world is immigrant. I know in Miami it doesn't sound like a lot, you know, the number here must be like 40% or whatever, right? But 3% in the world is a lot of people, okay? It only used to be 1% back in 1980. So it's been a remarkable increase, okay? And equally important, the US is by no means exceptional anymore when it comes to this. You can look at the numbers, you can see that a country like Greece is 10% immigrant, Germany 13%, France 11%, Sweden 14%. The US is in the middle of the pack, okay? So the fact is that most industrialized economies are now what we used to call the US. They're nations of immigrants. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. Large-scale immigration is all over the industrialized world. This is what it looks like in the US. Now the US is lucky in one way. We have kept records, and the crucial word here is legal. We have kept records of legal immigration since the 1820s. So the way to see this graph is by imagining the immigration people in Washington mailing out green cards. That's how many green cards were mailed out in each decade since the 1820s. Okay? The big peak, our 1900, is the one we all know from Hollywood movies. You know, Ellis Island, the boat, people looking up at the statue, crying, and so on and so forth. And that happened then. And you can see the reaction to that very quickly. It ended very suddenly. And by the 1930s, almost no immigrants were coming to the US legally. Since the 1930s, it's been going up rapidly. And right now, we're admitting over 10 million people legally per decade. So it's basically 1 million people a year legally. Okay? This is the history of policy. Now, if you go to the library, you will find stacks of books that are like 1,000 pages long on immigration policy, right? The history of policy. This is a PowerPoint slide that should make Bill Gates proud. It's reduced, 2,000 pages of laws into 4 regimes, right? And clearly I've ignored a lot of stuff, but basically this is the major things that have gone on, okay? Before 1875, no restrictions. Between 1875 and 1924, Congress got involved and began to add to a list of people who should not be allowed into the US. And none of those words are my words, those are all the words in the law. Okay? So when I say idiots, I don't call them idiots. That's the word the law used, okay? So anybody who was an Asian, or a convict, or an idiot, or a radical, or a public charge was not admissible. By 1924, that list was actually very, very, very long. And combined with the first Great Migration, which had a reaction, Congress said for the first time, let's make a new law and answer those two questions I posed earlier. So they created what's called the National Origins Quota System. That put in a numerical limit, and it said many more people want to come than we're willing to admit. So what are we going to do to allocate visas? We're going to use national origin. At the time, 2/3 of the US was either of British or of German ancestry. That means that 2/3 of the visas went to Great Britain and to Germany. So it was just a pure racial thing. Depending on what the national origin of the US was, that country will get so many visas. That system was in existence for about 40 years, and in '65, as part of the civil rights movement, it was decided that the national origins quota system was discriminatory, which it was, by definition, right? It's limiting who can get a visa. And they decided to replace them with something else. And that is the system that we have now, the family preference system. They increased the numbers a little bit, but basically they changed the way of allocating visas. Instead of using national origin to separate out the winners and losers, they're going to use family preferences. For most people in the world today, about the only way to come into the US legally is by having a family member already here to sponsor the entry. If you don't have that, it's extremely difficult to have a legal green card given out to you. Okay, this is the law. This is basically what we do now. So in the last decade, we admitted 10 million people, 1 million per year basically. And the four major parts of the law is family preferences, which I just talked about, and I'm going to return to that in a minute, okay? And that accounts for like 7 million, it's like 70% of all immigrants in the US come through family preferences. 2 million come from employment-based visas. And that's actually very misleading, because if you get an employment-based visa, you can bring your wife and your children, right? And your wife and your children count in part as those 2 million. So the number of visas actually given to the skilled worker or the employee, the visa, is actually much more than that. Refugees, many of us in this room came through that category, including myself. And diversity visas. The US, believe it or not, we have a lot of them, okay? Anybody in the world can apply to this law. And if you ever want to see it at work, it's like a website. You know when you get a form in your job about open enrollment for health insurance? It's the same thing. The State Department opens up a website, open enrollment for the diversity visa. And anybody in the world can apply. We raffle out on 45,000 visas a year. In other words, anybody can win this. Just to give you an idea of the demand for entry into the US, for 45,000 visas, the last couple of years, we've received between 10 and 15 million applications per year. So that just gives you an idea of why a limit has to exist. The demand for entry would be really quite dramatic if it didn't exist, okay? Now, family preferences. The way that works is, if you are a US resident or a citizen, you are entitled to sponsor the entry of certain people in your family. So for example, if I were a young man, and suppose I went to Cuba as a foreign student, okay? And I met a nice Cuban girl who I wanted to marry and brought her back. Well, that Cuban girl would be allowed to come with me because she'd be my wife. That's part of the family preferences. But what's really interesting is, within 5 years, my wife will become a citizen, which means her siblings are now qualified to enter the US, and she can sponsor their entry. But once her siblings come in, that means the sibling spouses can come in as well. But if the sibling spouses can come in, so can the sibling spouses' parents. And so can the sibling spouses' parents' siblings. So the siblings preference actually opens up the way for just, triangle, like a pyramid, an open-ended pyramid. A mathematical friend of mine actually worked out a formula to find out how many people in the world could actually apply as a result of this, if you let this go on for another 100 years. The entire world qualifies for entry in 100 years. The problem with that is that there are limits in the law, there are numerical limits. So that cannot happen. And just to give you an idea again of how crazy this whole system is, right now, if you apply for entry for your brother in around 1991 from the Philippines, your number just came up. So we have 20, 25-year queues in this kind of visa. Now, remarkably, we'll get it, if the comprehensive immigration reform bill in Congress right now passes, we're going to get rid of that. That is, even though you don't hear about that in the press, that is one of the crucial changes. They're getting rid of the siblings preference and replacing with something else I'll talk about at the end. Okay? All right, this is all legal. We also have illegal immigration. And what do we have about illegal immigration? This is what we have about illegal immigration. The Department of Homeland Security goes out every year and writes a little pamphlet. And that pamphlet is supposed to give you a number. And the number is how many illegal immigrants live in the US. And those are the official numbers. Now, as you all know, there's a big debate over how many illegal immigrants there actually are.
It's stopped.
Hmm?
It is stopped.
What do you mean? In the stock, yes, that's the stock as of that month. Exactly right. And let me tell you how they do this, because that's part of the debate as well. We obviously don't go out and count how many illegals there are. So what we do instead is, as I showed you in the very first slide, we keep very good track of how many green cards we mailed out. We can apply a mortality table to the number of green cards that we mailed out, and that gives you a number of how many foreign-born people should be alive in the US today. Put that number on one side of the paper. The Census Bureau goes out and surveys people, right? And they ask you, are you foreign-born? And we can count how many foreign-born people are living in the US. You take the difference, that's the number. So basically, those numbers imply that the Census Bureau, when they went out and counted people, found 12 million more people in January 2011 than we expected to find given the number of green cards we mailed out. Now, right there, you can see a problem with this. And the problem with this is that when the Census Bureau goes out and counts, they can't count everybody. And it would not be unreasonable to presume that the number of people they can count probably includes people who don't want to be counted, including illegals, particularly illegals. So therefore, they have to make an assumption about what the undercount rate is. If you open up the report and you read the text, you will not find that assumption. But if you go to the footnotes in very tiny print, you will find the assumption they make, and that's the assumption they've made forever, based on no data whatsoever. Okay? And the assumption is that the undercount rate for illegals is 10%. So we only miss 10% of illegals. If you believe that undercount rate is too high or too low, you can blow up these numbers accordingly, and that's part of what the argument is about. Okay, economics. This is the graph that I'm going to show you that has nothing to do with fancy econometrics. That's just a fact that if you opened up the census data, it shows up there, okay? And it's basically giving you the wage gap between immigrants and natives in each census. Believe it or not, back in 1960, just before some of us in this room came here, the typical immigrant in the US earned about 5% more than the typical native in the US. and you extend forward 40, 50 years, the typical immigrant in the US is earning about 20% less than the typical native in the US. And you might say, why do we care? Well, we care because this is reflecting something about the skill distribution of immigrants. And if there's anything we've learned in economics, is that it's the interaction between the skill distribution of immigrants and the skill distribution of natives that determines the impact of immigration. Believe me, we will be having a very different kind of debate today if that line was upward sloping instead of downward sloping. Okay? So it's this downward sloping nature of the line that is really driving a lot of what the debate is about. Now let me tell you 3 things that economists have done on this that are important. Clearly this is telling you different kinds of people are moving, right? In some sense. And an important question is to ask who moves. What kind of selection is going on? One of the remarkable things about immigration is that not everybody moves, even if they could, okay? There are many, many examples in the world where there are no legal restrictions preventing people from moving, and people still don't move. I'll give you 2 examples. One is there, which is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's wage is about 30–40% lower than the US wage for equal skills, even after controlling for price differences. If the world was composed of income maximizing rational human beings, Puerto Rico should be empty right now. But it's not. Only, a lot of people left, but even more chose to stay. Another great example is the Berlin Wall back in '61. Amazingly enough, before the Berlin Wall was built, people already knew what East Germany was like and what West Germany was like. All that an East German had to do to cross over before the Berlin Wall was built was literally get themselves to Berlin and cross the street. Once they were in West Berlin, they could take a train or a plane or something, whatever it was, and go to West Germany. That's all it took. No documents of any kind, no permission of any kind, and yet people didn't do it. There's just many documented examples in which people are free to leave and they choose not to leave. Migration costs must be, if you believe in the economic model, must be huge for this. So the important thing is, given that only some people leave, and not most people don't leave, what is it telling you about selection? The one economic model, sort of standard, basically tells you that the kinds of people who leave will depend on the payoff to leaving. So for example, if the country has a high rate of return to skills, skilled people don't want to leave the country. It'll be the only skilled who want to leave. If on the other hand, a country has a very low rate of return to skills, then the people who are really skilled are being taxed very heavily, right? And they'll want to go up. And that's actually not a bad description of the world. This is what happens if you compare the earnings of immigrants with the Gini coefficient for the country. The Gini coefficient more or less measuring the return to skills. In countries that have very equal income distributions, like for example Japan and Sweden at the very left of the graph here, the people who leave those countries tend to be highly skilled, very highly skilled compared to the people who stay. And it's not surprising, right? If you're skilled in Sweden, their system, for whatever reason, doesn't really reward your skills very much. The US will reward them more. If on the other hand, you look at a country like, at the very end, Haiti, the return to skills in Haiti are probably pretty high. If you're well off in Haiti, you're really well off in Haiti. Unfortunately, most people are not. And the people who tend to leave Haiti are not the most well-off people. So that's actually just the data. Again, no fancy econometrics in this. It's just the data showing you what happens to, if you compare entry earnings of immigrants in the US as a function of a measure of return to skills. So there's some selection going on in who migrates to the US. That's one question returning to that graph from before, showing you that the more recent ways to do so well, It has some bearing with it. It has some bearing with it. A second question is this one. And again, this is a question in every immigration debate that there is all over the world. What happens to the labor market in the receiving country when the immigrants get there? Okay? And I took a little quote out of Samuelson. For people my age, or older, or a little younger, when you took economics in college, that would have been the book you used. And I picked a particular year of Samuelson, 1964. And the reason I picked that year was because of before 1965, which is when the policy changed. So Samuelson is talking about a completely different world than the US is today, right? He's looking at a world where he says, after World War I, laws were passed, the National Organs Quota System, that limited immigration. We kept labor supply down, wages went up. Supply and demand, something we would teach in Economics 101. This is actually a very controversial thing to say, okay? Because if you believe that statement and you read it from today's perspective, it would say, since 1965, laws were passed liberalizing immigration. Many, many immigrants came. Therefore, by keeping labor supply high, wages were kept low. And that's actually a very controversial thing to say in today's world in the US, that somehow immigration could have a negative impact on the wage structure, even though it's a simple-minded implication of supply and demand that we would all teach in class the first day of class. Now, whether this is true or not, it's a different matter. This is what the theory tells you. The last 30 years, a very large number of labor economists have spent a lot of time trying to see if this is true or not. I think the best data on this is basically this graph. In this graph, what you do is look at the wage difference for a skill group over a decade between 2016 and 2010 as a function of how many immigrants went into that skill group. So let me tell you what a point is. Pick any point at random, and I'll describe it for you. That could be high school graduates in the early 30s. And what you're going to do is look at the wage of high school graduates in the early 30s for natives between, say, 80 and 90. And that would be the vertical axis. And then on the horizontal axis, how many immigrants came in that year or in that decade who were high school graduates in their early 30s. And what you see is that the groups that received the most immigrants tended to have lower wage, or the lower wage growth is a better way of putting it. In other words, the demand curve, you want to think of it that way, is downward sloping. You know, when the groups that experience the biggest shift in supply experience the smallest wage growth. Now, the number of that slope is not that big. It's 3, you know, a 10% increase in supply lowers the wage by 3 or 4%. So in the scheme of things, we're not talking about a huge impact. But don't forget, given that earlier graph that tells you that the kinds of immigrants who are coming in today has changed, most of the immigrant that is coming in today is at the two ends of the skill distribution. The US actually gets very few people in the middle of the skill distribution. We get many, many highly educated immigrants, and we get many, many, many more low educated immigrants. So the supply and demand argument will tell you this impact is really most dramatic among the groups that had the largest supply shifts, which happen to be low educated people. Okay? Oops, sorry. And this is basically telling you what that impact is like. So if you look at the first column, you can see for high school dropouts, basically it's about a 6% wage drop in the short run. You know, in other words, just like overnight. And then over time, it goes down to 3% because over time, the labor market adjusts, capital adjusts, and so on and so forth. Now, there's a crucial distinction between these two graphs, between these two slides. This is the data. That's just the data. Again, anybody can replicate this data by going to the Census Bureau website, the ICOMS website, downloading it, getting means, and just graphing it. Nothing fancy going on here. This is a lot of fancy stuff. So when I say theory-based analysis, I mean a lot of math. And therefore, I personally think this is much more trustworthy than this is, because this involves all kinds of other assumptions. Like, for example, the cup Douglas production function, all kinds of other stuff like that. But nevertheless, it's telling you that the impact is going to be concentrated at the low end, which is the graphic telling you also. That's where the supply shift happens. So that's number one. Now, I just talked to you about the distributional impact, but that's not the end of the whole thing. Because the fact that wages go down doesn't mean that money goes out into thin air. When wages go down, the person who's hiring you is much better off. So what immigration is doing is really redistributing wealth. And again, this is all theory-based, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. But nevertheless, if you believe supply and demand and economic theory, you can grind out the following numbers as to the impact on net. On net, the US gains from immigration. But a remarkable thing that we have now seen from these models is that it's impossible to manipulate the model mathematically to get that gain to be very big. So it's on $30 billion per year. Now, 30 billion is a lot of money to me, but in the scheme of the US economy, which is a $15 trillion GDP, it's really just rounding off error. What's really going on here is distribution. So once you realize that, it's really, it puts the whole debate over immigration in a new focus, right? It's really a distributional debate. Some people win, some people lose. The people who lose are people who compete with immigrants. The people who win are people who use immigrants. And by using, I mean that in a very broad sense, right? It could be the employer, or it could be me when I go to the supermarket. So whoever uses immigrants to some extent gains. Whoever competes with immigrants loses. And that's really what the debate is about. All right, let me turn to one more economic issue, which is the public charge issue. And again, it's easy, it's sort of nice to put it in historical context. In historical context, the public charge concern over immigration goes back to 1645, okay? Which is before the US was the US. The very liberal and very enlightened colony of Massachusetts passed legislation prohibiting the entry of poor immigrants. So this goes back, 130 years before the US, before 1776, okay? In 1691, the New York colony hired an economist for consulting. And this economist said to the New York colonists, the way to avoid getting poor immigrants is by putting up a bonding system. And they actually enacted that into law. So if you wanted to bring in your poor relatives into New York in 1691, you had to put up a bond with the government. And that bond would be funds that the government would use if the relative you brought in got sick and needed some kind of help. And it goes back to 1691. Now that actually all happens to have a very modern day consequence. As all of you know, there's a big debate in the Supreme Court as to whether Arizona or whoever has the right to do certain things about immigration, right? It all goes back to that. Because in 1876, the Supreme Court said all these state laws are illegal or unconstitutional. And don't forget from the slide I showed you earlier, that happens to be the time when Congress began to put in things in the law, right? As to who was not admissible. The convicts and the public charges and so on. So the Supreme Court stepped in. The state did this for hundreds of years. The Supreme Court steps in and says, the states cannot do that. Congress steps in and says, we're going to make a list of people who cannot come in. And in 1882, Congress said, people who cannot take care of themselves cannot come into the country. And that's been the law since 1882. That's never changed. In 1903, Congress went further and said, even though people who cannot take care of themselves are not admissible, some of them somehow make it. And if they do make it, we have to report them. And that's been the law for 110 years. So as the law now reads, believe it or not, the public charges are not admissible. And if an immigrant becomes a public charge after entry, they're deportable. Now, needless to say, none of that is ever enforced. because the data tells you a very different picture. Again, no fancy econometrics. This is just CPS data. CPS, Current Population Survey, began in 1994 to ask about immigration background. And this is the fraction of people, native born, foreign born, who receive assistance. And you can basically see right now, something like 20% of native born households receive one of these types of aid. And so do 30% of immigrant households. Okay? So those are the facts. Again, no fancy economics. Those are just the facts. And again, I don't imply any kind of moral statement in this. I am not saying that the US is a welfare magnet. I am not saying these immigrants come in to take advantage of the US. I'm not saying any of that. These are just the facts. The fact is the US has developed a very highly, developed welfare system designed to help particular kinds of people when they need help. Well, if you let in a lot of low-skilled people, all kinds of things happen. People get sick, they move around, they have accidents, they have children, and they happen to be unqualified. So that wasn't the original motivation for migrating, but it's just that we have a system designed to help people like that. Okay, so having said all that, let me return to the question from the beginning. What does all this imply about immigration policy? What should we do? Okay? I hate to tell you this. I invited me here to be here to tell you the lesson, but I've thought about this for a long time, and I have a very simple answer as to what all this implies. And the answer is nothing at all. Okay? And the reason it's nothing at all is because we economists tend to be very misleading, if not actually dishonest, about what our work means for public policy. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Suppose that you believe everything I just told you, okay? And, immigrants come in, they tend to be low-skilled, they have an impact on low-skilled workers, they use welfare, and so on and so forth, right? Then we put on a hat. And the hat I'm going to put on is, I'm going to try to defend the native-born interests, okay? And I'm going to try to defend native-born. My native-born actually means something much broader. I want to defend, let's actually think of it this way, since many of us here in this room are immigrants. We're trying to set up a system, as of right now, whether we should close the door tomorrow morning. So by definition, all of us are neighbors. What should we do tomorrow afternoon? Okay? Suppose I happen to care about the people in this room. Those are the people who are my concern. So it's the people who are here now that I want to worry about. Well, if the people that are here now I want to worry about, I don't really want to add a group of people who are going to hurt the least skilled amongst us, or a group of people who are going to increase our taxes, right? So all these facts I just told you would say immigration policy should be one, but we try to avoid all that. We should go back to enforcing the law, right? The public charges should be deported, they're deportable. And we shouldn't let in low-skilled people because they really increase a lot of inequality in this country. And that was one implication of the theory, of the data. Let me take off that hat and put another hat. And the other hat I'm going to put on is the hat that says, I really care about poor people all over the world. I'm very humanitarian-minded. I really, all these poor people really make me feel for them, and I care about them a lot. It implies very different policies depending on the hat I put on, depending on the objective function. And that's the thing that economists never really are very honest about. Policy doesn't come out of data. Policy comes out of values. And it's your values that really determine what you should do tomorrow. If your values are, let's care about who your neighbors are, who your neighbors right now, that implies a particular set of policies. If by a neighbor you mean a much broader global perspective, that implies a different kind of policy. And who am I to say which is the right perspective? I mean, I'm no one. I have my opinions on this, but it's just my opinion. It's not informed by any data. So each of us has its own set of values, and we can never agree on that. We can agree on the facts, but we can never agree on what to do with the facts. Because what to do has nothing to do with the facts. It has to do with values. And with that in mind, it's actually then worth returning to these questions. Because think about it. We want to know how many immigrants to admit, and which kinds of immigrants to admit. There's actually nothing in economics that tells us how many. I mean, that would be, the easy answer to an economist is, until marginal cost equals marginal revenue. But, how do you measure this? So there's actually nothing in the literature that would tell us whether a million right now is too much or too little. I mean, this is nothing available empirically to answer that. The which we know more about. But again, that depends on the kinds of things that you have in mind. And to show you what I mean by that, take another country as an example. I mean, it's a great thing to do when you get back to your hotel rooms tonight or home, for those of you who live in the city, Google Canada immigration. That will bring you to the Canadian immigration website. And act as if you want to move to Canada. Okay? Just act as if for tonight. If you say, I want to move to Canada, they will then open up a web page for you, and they will give you a test. Believe it or not. And they'll grade it according to the answers you give. And because it's a modern web, the answers are instantly graded and everything is updated instantaneously. So you know where you stand with every question. And they will ask you things like, how old are you? Over 55, like myself, too bad. We really just want younger people. They will ask you, how much education do you have? I'll say, PhD, great answer. You say, high school dropout? They say, go to the US. They will ask you, what do you do for a living? If you say chef, that's a great answer. They're looking for cooks all the time, it seems. Every time I open up a website, they want cooks. You say economist, not such a good answer. So the point is, somebody in Canada has thought through what it is they want to accomplish. And what they want to accomplish is they presume that this particular set of characteristics will be the ones that improve the well-being of the native population. So they've answered that. And they're not embarrassed to say it. We want to maximize the economic well-being of the native population. And again, by native, I don't mean born in Canada. I mean people in Canada today looking forward to the next 20 years. The US, we don't admit it, but we also ask the question. And we also have this kind of point system. Oh, by the way, before I leave Canada, one more thing I should tell you. At the end of the test, they will have all the answers, all these points. And then they'll say, this month, the passing grade is 68. If you got more than 68, go see the consular official in your city. You're less than 68, sorry. They actually change these numbers all the time. So not only have they thought this through, but depending on economic conditions, they will change things accordingly. In the US, we cannot do that. Everything is written into law. So we have to have the same immigration policy whether your unemployment rate is 10% or 2%. It doesn't make any difference. Everything is written into law, and as you know by looking at the debate right now, it is very hard to change immigration policy. It hasn't changed that often. The House has to approve it, the Senate has to approve it, and the President has to approve it all at the same time. This is a very hard, set of coincidences for it to happen. So we're stuck with whatever we put into law for 50 years. And if we change the law this year, we'll be stuck with that for 50 more years. Okay, so let me now tell you a couple of things about the current debate that are sort of interesting. Because in the current debate, as I said before, we're going to get rid of the siblings preference. And believe it or not, what they're replacing it with is a Canada-style point system. Again, you don't see that in the press because the press is mainly fixated on the amnesty versus no amnesty division of part of the law. But they're actually putting in a point system that depends on education and experience. And that system could actually be up to 250,000 visas per year once it gets fully going. So for the first time ever, if this thing goes through, the US would actually begin the path towards adopting Canadian-style policy. And that, I think, is far more important than the whole issue of amnesty. Because that sets in a path that will be very, very hard to change in the future because these things don't change often. And the demand for highly skilled workers, given everything we know, is going to be very, very high. That's actually probably the most important part of the legislation right now. We're getting rid of the citizen preference that allows for this exploiting pyramid to happen, and we're going to replace it with a much larger point system, if it really goes through. Okay? Now, so I said, we should do what's best for us, right? And each of us has a different opinion about that. Well, let me just tell you how difficult this question really is, okay? Think of the world as being composed of three populations, okay? There's us, natives. There's the immigrants. And there's the rest of the world. Most people in the US, when they think about immigration policy, they really have us in mind. We should do what's best for us. Canada, for example, has clearly thought about it and said it's what's best for us. The fact of the matter is that any immigration policy you set is going to make the lucky few who get the visas very, very lucky. They're going to be better off. So immigrants are going to be better off. But then you have the rest of the world to worry about. And should we be concerned about that at all? And let me give you a story of why I think we should be concerned about that. Every country in the world that receives immigrants seems to want to receive many highly skilled immigrants. I mean, that's what we're all in the market for, right? We're in the market for high skilled immigrants. The H-1B visa debate, for example, the point system in Canada, a new point system they instituted in Germany, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, all these countries are competing for high skilled immigrants. The problem is that there really aren't that many high skilled people in the world. Okay, there's a limit. There's a scarce commodity. And I was in London a few years ago, and I'll never forget picking up, and I don't know if this is true or not. I wish I could write a paper on this, because if it's true, it would be a remarkable thing. But there was something in the paper about the fact that the National Health Service, the NHS, the socialized medicine in the UK, they had a hard time attracting native-born British people to be doctors. Physicians, being a doctor in the UK, because of the payment system I guess the NHS puts in, has become a job natives don't want to do, if you want to use the usual phrase. So the way they solve the problem is by importing a lot of foreign-born doctors. And they've imported so many foreign-born doctors that there were a couple of African countries where something like 95% of all the doctors they've ever produced are now in London practicing. Now, that's great for the NHS, and it's great for British people, right? They're healthier, they get somebody else to pay for the education of doctors, and they can enjoy the output. But think about the people left behind in these countries. There's no medical professionals left. Should we be worried about that? And so that's what I'm trying to tell you. It is impossible to devise an immigration policy that makes everybody better off. It's just not going to happen. So we have to make a really important decision in our minds, which is the last question there. Whose well-being do we want to maximize? And that is not an economic question. That's a value question. You tell me what the answer to that is, and I know what the immigration policy should be. A lot of my friends know that I work on immigration for many, many years, right? And they know that. They always ask me, what should we do? And I always say to them, who are you rooting for? You tell me who you're rooting for, and the answer of what you should do is very, very clear. So, next time you hear about the immigration debate, just realize that arguing over a fence, arguing over a green card for a few million people is not really what it's about. I mean, a lot of people are hurt by this or helped by this, but that's not really what's at the core of this. What's at the core of this is, who do you care about? What kind of country do we want to be? You answer that, and everything about immigration policy will follow in a very linear fashion from that point on. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm sure we've got a smorgasbord of eager viewers here to bombard you with questions. I'm going to take the president's prerogative and be the first. I had the privilege of being a sociologist who teaches courses on immigration to the United States, and I have to say that I learned many things from the clarity of your presentation, and I also admit that when we sent out the announcement that we would have Jorge Borjas, the eminent Harvard economist Jorge Borjas, as our keynote speaker at the ASCE conference, all of the responses weren't universally supported. I actually had a good friend of mine who said, "You have Jorge Borjas who's coming to speak?" And I said, "Yes." And she says, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because the board of ASCE voted, agreed, and invited him. That's how it works at ASCE." And she says, "Oh my goodness, he's going to speak there. Wow. I don't think I'm going to come this year." And I was like, "Fine." Well, I have to say, after hearing you speak, that my friend missed out. I really appreciate you being here and sharing your analysis with us and your honesty about values and how they relate to immigration policy, because I think you're right. A lot of times, that piece of the puzzle is missing. My question has to do with a fellow Cuban-American academic named Alejandro Portes. Alejandro spoke at the Carlos Diaz Alejandro lecture earlier this year for ASCE, and he has also studied and written a lot about immigration. And I'm going to give you maybe a cheap opportunity to respond or to point out, how do you think that, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, how do you think that his conclusions or arguments, even going to the facts, because some of the things that you talked about as facts, I think that some people would agree that they're facts, but some people maybe have different facts. So how might your argument or your presentation differ from what the main thrust of his would be, if you could address that?
I don't want to put, Alejandro's fair point, I don't want to put any words in his mouth whatsoever, okay? But I don't think he's ever worked on the selection issue, for example, or on the labor market impact, or on the public welfare issue. What he's really worked most on is what happens intergenerationally in assimilation, as you know. And I didn't talk that much about that. He and I probably are not that far away when it comes to intergenerational stuff. Because part of his work is basically arguing that the old-fashioned assimilationist kind of story that goes back to the 1920s is not really true, right? And might not apply in today's world. And he probably has a very good point. You know, he probably has a very good point that whatever we saw, I mean, I think we often make a mistake in immigration in a really crucial way. And we make the mistake, like everything I just showed you today is for the US. A lot of countries look at the US as an example and say, we should, you know, this is what's done in the US, therefore we should apply it here. You know, it's a very specific kind of thing that may not transfer. And I think Alejandro's point is really well taken when it comes to that. Because whatever it was that led to the assimilation pattern that we saw in the 1900s may not be around in the year 2000. I mean, I'll just give you one very simple example of that. And that is that in I forget the exact date, but in 1917 or something like that, when Henry Ford had the Ford Motor Company, something like 75% of all people working at the Ford Motor Company were foreign born. You know, that's something that's not well known, but the immigrants back then built the manufacturing sector in the US. Now that's actually a great thing for them to have happened, because Henry Ford raised the wage, those jobs became unionized, those jobs were family jobs. If you work for Ford, your children work for Ford, your grandchildren work for Ford, you were guaranteed a middle class life basically, right? That's not true today. We don't have that today. So just because it happened then, doesn't mean it's going to happen today. Today it could be better, or it could be worse. We just don't know. So I mean, Alejandro and I don't agree on everything, I mean, to be completely honest, but on the fact that you cannot take things out of context and sort of like mechanically apply them, I couldn't agree more. You know, I think that's a horrible mistake that we tend to do. We tend to look at a particular study and somehow apply it in many different contexts. You really cannot do that with immigration.
Thank you. All right, let's see here.
George. That was an excellent presentation, as he already pointed out. As you know, I also work on immigration, but I am a sociologist, and I tend to take a historical perspective on issues. I was very pleased to see that you also historicized a great deal of your presentation. But it seems to me that there is one question that you asked that doesn't have the historical framework to it, and it could benefit from having the historical framework to it. And that is, the way you phrased it was, do immigrants alter the employment opportunities of native workers? I think the usual way in which it's stated is, do immigrants take jobs away from Americans? Okay, and that is in fact a cover of Newsweek sometime back in 1976, and it has recurred and recurred, that said that immigrants were a silent invasion. And of course, most of the time it's referring to Mexicans, Central Americans, what you, in your work, would call low-skilled immigrants. I actually think that it's of course, it's a sharp question and one that we should think about, but it's not one that has only one answer. I think that the answer depends on the historical period. I think that there are periods of stability economically and economic growth in which that type of low-skilled immigrant is actually doing the jobs that the native middle-class sort of workers don't want to do. And so there, in fact, you get like two labor forces, you know, a sort of native-born labor force, and underneath that, that sort of low-skilled immigrant cheap labor force that is doing the jobs that the other ones don't want. And what happens, and I think it's happening now, is that at times of economic instability, economic downturn, unemployment and so on, that then the sort of the above labor force, the middle class, the working class, the stable people and so on, begin to drop into that other area in which then there is competition for jobs, and in which then it does feel like they're taking jobs away from each other. So I think that the answer depends on the historical period, like depression and like now.
Can I answer that, or? Yeah, okay, I completely agree with you that whatever impact there is going to depend very much on the context. Okay, the impact of immigration today is going to be very different than if we had it back in 1935. I mean, it's just inevitable, okay? Where I disagree with you and with sociologists in general, and with a lot of non-economists who sort of look at this, is in the question you posed, which is, do immigrants take jobs away, or immigrants do jobs natives don't want to do? That's the way it's usually phrased. Immigrants do jobs natives don't want to do. I think that's just, to an economist, that statement makes no sense whatsoever, I'm sorry to say, okay? And the reason is that the correct statement is, immigrants don't do jobs, immigrants do jobs natives don't want to do at the going wage. And that's really the correct statement. If there were no people to do those jobs, the market would adjust. I mean, a great example of this is New York City, okay? You get up in LaGuardia, and you know, suppose you're a Martian, coming for the very first time to this earth, and you land in LaGuardia for whatever reason, right? You get off in LaGuardia, and you go get a cab into Manhattan, because you've heard Manhattan is a great place to visit. And my God, every single person driving a cab in Manhattan is foreign born. You infer from that the only people who can drive cabs are foreign born people. Well, get up, go to Iowa, okay? You get up in an airport in Iowa, and my God, these blonde, blue-eyed, 20-year-old kids are driving a cab. How could they do that? And the reason is, probably New York cabs are a lot cheaper. You know, there's a big supply of people who want to drive a cab, and Iowa didn't have the big supply shock, the market adjusted. That doesn't mean that people won't lose as a result of that. It just means that it's more money. Same thing with landscaping. You would think, if you live in Southern California, that unless you have a big supply of illegal immigrants who tend your lawn and mow your lawn for you and do everything they do for you, no lawns would ever be green. That's not true. There actually are people who do lawn work who are not illegal Mexican immigrants. It might cost a lot more, believe me, I can tell you that from experience. When I moved from California to Boston, it cost a lot more. But nevertheless, the prices adjust. And that's what's really wrong with saying, you know, immigrants do jobs natives don't want to do. Yes, but you have to add at the going wage. And if the demand is there, the prices will adjust. Now, they might adjust more or less in particular markets, in particular things, but there's an adjustment mechanism called the market for all this.
Yes, I'm an American citizen living overseas, so I look at the immigration question with the perspective of, I suppose, emigration as well. And I wanted to ask whether there's any coordination between immigration policy and emigration policy. That is, things that encourage or discourage Americans or people from any other country from living or going to live outside that country. Tax rules or whatever it may be. Or is there even an emigration policy? That's basically the question.
I don't think it's been true historically in the US, just because in the US, immigration has to be set by statute and not by regulation. It may well be true that in Canada, where these things vary from day to day, there could be all kinds of bureaucratic sort of wrinkles one could play. But in the US, it'll be very, very difficult, I would think. I mean, don't forget, we're living right now in a regime that was put into law in 1965 and has barely changed since then. And the world is very different today than 1965.
Ken Erickson with the State Department. Enjoyed your presentation. I was wondering, what's your view of the Cuban Adjustment Act and how it's impacted immigration between the two countries? And secondly, has there been any discussion of that in terms of the overall migration debate in Washington, or is that just something that's a separate thing?
I have never really followed that. I mean, I could tell you a personal opinion, which would be completely worthless, okay? So I just never studied it or anything like that. I really don't.
If you could take your argument that wages should adjust to bring people into the labor market at the low end, could you apply that same argument to the high skilled end? In other words, I've never understood the argument from the computer industry, etc. There's no workers to do this work, therefore we need to bring in foreigners. I've always thought, well, why don't you raise the wage to engineers? Now, it may be that there would be an adjustment period to get more educated people, but then why don't these companies give more money to engineering schools so they would produce more engineers? Why isn't the wage adjustment working in that high-skilled area?
Oh, I believe it does, actually. I mean, I think that immigration has really had an impact in particular kinds of the high school sector. You talk to the engineers in Silicon Valley about the impact of the H-1B visa program, and you get a very different answer than what you will get from Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, right? So, the engineers actually know what is happening in Silicon Valley, and that is that there's an impact on the wage. Lowers the wage.
George, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question. I remember in the 80s when the discussion was centering around IRCA, that a lot of people said, and they cited evidence from Europe, that any country that ever had an amnesty would have other amnesties to follow. So, obviously it seems to me that, and I'm sure you're in this debate, and the argument here would be that you mentioned the chain migration that will take over. How are those who are looking for blanket amnesty, whatever date you choose to, are they planning to interrupt the chain? I mean, is this by implementing the selective criteria, by employer sanctions, or what's going on in that area?
Okay, is the question what should we do about illegal immigration in a general sort of way?
The question was that, a lot of people would argue that if you have an amnesty, you are simply setting the ground for more people to come in because of the family reunification.
Right.
So where do you stop the change?
I honestly don't know if that's true or not. Okay, I don't know of any study that's looked at the impact of a previous amnesty on a future amnesty or future illegal immigration. And as an economist, what I can tell you is you make things easier, you lower the price of anything, the demand for it will go up. And I can apply that logic to answer your question. But again, it's based completely on intuition about the way things work as opposed to anything else. So I don't really have a professional answer as to whether the amnesty we're going to give now for 10, 12 million people, whatever, will create a problem later on. But I mean, if you lower the price of something, the demand for it will go up. That I can tell you.
Gabriel Rivera from DIMF. I have a question. I don't know actually how to frame it well, but is there anyone in the field, I'm not a legal economist at all, but is there anyone in the field has studied the intergenerational effect of immigration? For instance, I mean, you can put as an input a low-skilled immigrant from Mexico and get 2 generations afterwards an output of sons that are PhDs or congressmen. So from that perspective, is there any insight that you can provide us?
You mean talking about how long ethnicity sort of lasts intergenerationally? There's a lot of studies on that. There's a ton of studies on that. And the answer, I think, is basically that, look, you can tell from the graph I showed with the Gini coefficient, in the immigrant generation, there's a huge variance in how different groups do, right? That's also true in the second generation. Not as big a variance, but there's going to be some variance. I think if I were to sort of take a takeaway lesson from the data, is that if any two groups are like 50 percentage points apart in the immigrant generation, they'd be half that in the second generation, and then half that in the third generation. So basically, like the half-life of any difference is like one generation, and that's not far from what we tend to find with parents and children as well. So yeah, ethnicity matters. Doesn't matter forever, but it matters. Now, one more thing I should tell you as a word of warning is that the only data we have on this really is the U.S. experience in the 1900s. Okay? And as I was saying before about how this relates to what's going to happen in the future, the intergenerational U.S. experience in the 1900s may or may not be replicable. I mean, one great thing to suggest that it may not be is the whole notion of ethnicity and affirmative action. You know, if you went to school in 1920 in New York City, the point of the school system was to grind out a little American kid out of you, right? That's not the point of the school system today. And whether that hurts or helps assimilation, I have no idea. No, we don't know yet. But we don't have the same conditions. So that's the one thing I will tell you. Whatever happened back then in the last century doesn't really provide a lesson for what's going to happen in the next century.
Okay, on that note, we're going to thank Professor Borjas for his outstanding lecture. We could take this up next door with the drinks, so see you there.